Welcome to our third class on David. Let's start with a quick review. The last time we talked about work and how work should be an act of worship. In other words, we must let God inform and guide our work because work reveals our character and our values. Today we turn to David and Goliath. David and Goliath is one of the greatest children's stories. The little guy wins. But please don't dismiss the story because now you're grown up and you've heard the story dozens of times. As adults, we can learn new things from old stories because stories bring us back to the basics, and we need to review the basics regularly. For instance, Cinderella teaches us that being cruel doesn't pay. Beauty and the Beast teaches us to value a person's inner characteristics like kindness more than superficial qualities like appearance. Green Eggs and Ham reverses what we think we like and don't like. Stories are a way we can explore intangible things like hope, trust, and love, and learn that they're real. Stories also allow us to exercise our imagination. As adults, our imaginations have often gotten flabby and out of shape, so we can't see how life could change, how God could touch us. David's story helps us understand how God uses everyday life to shape us into who we were created to be. God is helping us to mature, to do this thing we call adulting. So far, David has taught us we're chosen by God regardless of the world or what our families say. We've learned that God uses our work to develop our character and purpose in life. Next, we'll ask the question, who dominates our imagination, our worldview, God or Goliath? Let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17 and review the story. Saul and his army are faced off against the Philistines. And we read in 1 Samuel chapter 17. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with a valley between them. A champion named Goliath came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. Now let's put this in context for us today. Goliath stood 8 to 9 feet tall, depending on the translation. His armor weighed over 90 pounds. His spear itself weighed over 15 pounds. He was a big dude with impressive strength, and he had the most technologically advanced weapons at his disposal, and he knew it. So we read in 1 Samuel 17, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Goliath dominates this scene. Each day he taunted the Israelites, made them feel smaller, more cowardly. Goliath had become the center of the world for Israel, for the army, for Saul. Goliath's size, his brutality, and his cruelty controlled their imagination, dictated their worldview. Now David walks into the scene as we continue to read. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them." David was on a mission of kindness to his brothers, bringing food to them and hoping to return home to his father with good news of his brothers in the battle. But let's continue to read and see what kind of welcome David actually received. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave these few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" Eliab's imagination, his ability to see beyond his current circumstances, was so battered he couldn't even see a simple act of kindness. The moment we allow cruelty or dishonesty or insincerity to capture our imaginations, to shape how we think and respond, we struggle to see things and people who are good, true, and beautiful. But David was different. David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David was incredulous that the others were cowering. Why did this little shepherd boy, who was dismissed by his own family, also tremble when Goliath roared? But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear." David already had practice fighting lions and bears while he spent time alone in the wilderness, tending all of his sheep. Was he just stronger, more practiced with weapons, able to outsmart a bear? We continue in the story. David said, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." This is the reason David was able to fight wild animals. He had God's strength. David spent time in the wilderness, immersed in the experience of God. When he faced a lion who was trying to steal a lamb, he didn't hear the lion's roar. He heard the voice of God. David learned to see God working in the external world because he allowed God to shape his inner world. David had a God-shaped imagination, a God-shaped world, where God was the only reality, not any giant who tried to bully their way into David's life. So David walked into the camp where Goliath had taunted Saul's army for 40 days. David heard Goliath and decided to fight. Nobody else was. As we read, David said to Saul, "Let no one lose a heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Now, did Saul cheer David's decision, marvel at his courage? Not hardly. Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." Saul said, "But you're just a boy. You're too young. You don't have experience, no credentials. I can't imagine you would even consider doing something so foolish." But Saul said, "Well, but if you're going to do that, something so foolish, let me try and help you out." Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Saul wanted David to put armor on, to live in a world where Goliath ruled and God was merely an afterthought, a world where you had to protect yourself by yourself. But David can hardly move in the armor that represented a Goliath worldview. David knows that borrowed armor is a disaster. David needed what was authentic to him, to use only what he had been trained to do, what he was experienced with. David chose to be authentic to how God created and trained him. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. David proceeded to do everything wrong. When he stooped to pick up the 5 smooth stones, he had to kneel. If you kneel, you take your eyes off your enemy, mistake number 1, and you can't run, mistake number 2. When Saul saw that, I'm sure his heart sank because he knew David had no idea how to fight Goliath. And Goliath was probably gleeful, knowing his victory was a foregone conclusion. But David kneeling is essential to understanding him. David knew he could choose to live life standing, wearing somebody else's armor, following conventional wisdom, and not being authentic to himself. Or he could choose to live life from his knees, with a worldview that was powered by God and authentic to who God created and called him to be. David knew that we could be shaped by fear of God or by fear of Goliath. And then the critical moment arrives. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Here's the question. Does God still speak? Does he still act? Does David believe God acts? What does Saul believe? What do David's brothers believe? What does the army believe? What does Goliath believe? Well, David believed God still acts. This world is filled with anxious Sauls and cruel Goliaths. They're either not listening to God's voice or not responding to it. Yet David chose to kneel, unhurried and calm, because he trusted in God's ways. His imagination was big enough that he had a God's perspective. He knew the battle was the Lord's. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. David first kneels, and then in an instant, he's running, swinging the sling. Goliath grunts, stops, crumples, and dies. All because David chose to immerse himself in God's reality, to allow God to expand his imagination, his worldview, and not be limited by the world's fear or the world's brutality. David chose to let his imagination see beyond his current circumstances to the limitless God he followed. So some important takeaways from today. We can choose to live our lives shaped by God or by Goliath. We need to immerse ourselves in the world of God, his power and his truth, so that we can see God's reality. Allow your imagination to expand, to see God's world, not the world of the brutal Goliaths or the fearful Sauls. Now, I'd encourage you to check out the discussion guide, which also includes study suggestions and other activities. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep the faith.